All right, we should be live. I'll give this just a few seconds for people to see to check in, make sure it's all working correctly. Um, this week, the Southern Baptist Convention held its annual meeting. A lot of stuff happened, and while I can try to put a spin on it, while I could try to see what happened, make sense of it from my perspective, I figured the best person to talk to about this would be someone who was there, someone who's been covering this stuff for several years. And I wanted to let all of you have a chance to ask some questions as well. So let me bring him in here. This is Bob Smietana. He is a national writer for Religion News Service and someone whose articles about the SBC and about religion in general just really provide a lot of insight into what's going on and, more importantly, why it matters, especially to atheists who may not understand necessarily why something like a meeting of the Southern Baptists matters outside their particular bubble. So, Bob, thanks for joining me here. And I guess the first question is, before we get into the specifics, why were you there? And you have been there the past few years, I believe. What was different about the vibe this time around? Let's do that one more time, and we're gonna unmute you this time.
Oh,
there we go.
Is that better? Sorry, I thought I
That's
unmuted.
all good. So yeah, what was the vibe like this time around?
So it was interesting. So there it was actually less tense than it's been in the last few years. There has been a kind of for lack of a better term, a kind of MAGA wing of the SBC that has been concerned that the SBC is too liberal for talking about race and sexual abuse and not being as committed to the GOP. So there was that group has mostly died out. So that was, and then there was a lot of question. There was a lot of the big overarching issue was this issue over women pastors and whether they're going to amend their constitution to ban any church that had a woman, any woman with the title of pastor in their on their staff. So that was kind of overshadowing everything. I think you're muted right now.
I think I am. Look at that. I'll figure out how this works one day. Is this any different than what they've been dealing with in the past few years? Because there are always hot button cultural issues that seem to be at the forefront every time the Southern Baptists have their annual convention. And gender parity and things like that, that doesn't seem new. So was this year any different in that sense?
It's yes and no. I mean, there's always some big issue. And actually, for a while, the SBC's annual meeting, when I went there in 2008, it was fairly small, 6,000 people. This one was about 13,000 people in total. About 11,000 of those were messengers, or which are local church representatives. So there were a lot more people there. This is what was different this time were a couple things. So we know the Southern Baptists have a number of years ago passed a law, basically believe that only men can be the senior pastor, and that's been the practice. But a couple of years ago, that a lot more attention was placed on if whether women preach or if there's any women on staff at church. So you had a rule saying only men can be pastors that wasn't applied very much. You had some churches with senior pastors who were women, and then all of a sudden someone noticed a couple of years ago, and that became a big deal. So there was a church that was right next to the biggest seminary in denomination for years in the same association. So they're, so the churches, everyone knew this church had a woman pastor. No one cared until 2 years ago. Then it became a big deal, and the church got thrown out. So that has changed a bit.
Let's talk about that one for a second, because this happened this week. The delegates, the people who were voting at this convention, they voted to kick out this church in Virginia, the First Baptist Church of Alexandria, because they had this woman who was their lead pastor. But why was, before we get into other votes they took, why was that vote so overwhelming? And why were they like ratted out 2 years ago?
So actually, that's a different church. So 2 years ago, there's a church in Kentucky. This one in Virginia is different. This was a little bit different in that they had a woman who is a staff pastor, and it's not that far from there's a pastor named Mike Law who noticed that churches had women pastors and proposed this constitutional amendment about it. So this one was interesting because they had a woman who's like the associate pastor, been there a long time. But what really sort of tipped things over is when they basically asked the church, how do you see her? Is she just a staff pastor, or is she someone eligible to be the senior pastor? And when they said, well, no, she could become senior pastor, and any woman could be, that job is open to men and women, that's what kind of tipped them over. So that's kind of a tipping point for them.
And that church in Virginia, I think they had something on their website that kind of declared.
Yes, yeah. So that's the other thing. They asked them what they thought, and they told them what they thought, and that was not going to work for the Southern Baptist. So a lot of things have gone on in the Southern Baptist Convention. One thing is that this idea of complementarianism, that there are complementary roles for men and women, has really expanded at their seminaries in the last 20 years. So you have a lot of pastors now who just think that's the way it ought to be, and are not willing to let other churches disagree with them, if that makes sense.
Why was that vote, though? It didn't seem like that was a controversial vote. Like, this church said men and women could be like lead pastors, that the Bible didn't delineate between the two. Everyone has gifts. It didn't seem like the vote to expel this particular church was at all controversial in the grand scheme of things.
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. So that's pretty much a bright line for them. If you say that, I suppose it would be like the Catholic Church, right? If you say that woman could be a priest, then you're not going to be a Catholic. It's not like they're, it's just kind of that means you're not a Southern Baptist. You could be a Baptist. You could do whatever you want. That's fine. You just can't be one of us.
Okay. So last year, I believe one of the big takeaways from their convention is they kicked out Saddleback Church, Rick Warren's church, for something similar. Can you explain what they did then? And I'm really curious to know, what has the fallout been with Saddleback since then? Because maybe that came up
Saddleback
as well.
That hasn't gone. Saddleback has sort of gone on its own way. Saddleback changed preachers, and that's a complicated story too. So let me back up. So a couple things are going on here. As you probably know, there's been a big sexual abuse scandal in the SBC. That's been big news. That's been kind of one of the ongoing stories. And right in the middle of that, there's a Bible teacher named Beth Moore, very, very popular among Southern Baptists. She basically tweeted that she was going to be preaching on a Mother's Day at a church. And then all of a sudden, this became an uproar. So this became a huge issue. Everyone wanted to talk about women preaching in churches and women leaders. And they also, the sex abuse scandal also led to some reforms. But this women preacher thing became a big deal. That's one thing that's happened. Around the same time, Saddleback, which is one of the largest churches in the country, ordained several women as staff pastors. So that led to a complaint to the Southern Baptists that, oh wait, they're not part of us, which led to an interesting moment a couple of years ago. So there was a committee called the Credentials Committee. So basically, if you want to have what are called messengers, if you want to send a representative to the annual meeting, you have to be considered in good standing or friendly cooperation, they call it. So someone gets up and says, I think Saddleback is not in friendly cooperation. They report it to the Credentials Committee. The Credentials Committee comes back and says, we need help because we don't know what in their statement of faith says that the role of pastor is limited to men. They came back and said, well, what do you mean by the word pastor? Do you mean the senior pastor? Do you mean anyone who has a title, like a staff minister, the music minister, the kids
like at the time, Rick Warren was at the top of the pyramid, there, and these women were not him.
No, they were not him. They were kind of, so for a long time, there has been kind of two views. One, that an assumption that, the word pastor meant the senior pastor, and others who thought, well, it meant any pastor. But the senior pastor was really the one that would get you in trouble. And this led, and of course, if you get up in a bunch of Southern Baptists and ask, what is a pastor? Which was a fair question. What the really question is, in the statement of faith, when you say the word pastor, are you talking about the senior pastor or everybody? Well, that became, an uproar. Folks got up and said, what do you mean? We know what a pastor is. And then they never got any help. But they that led to this kind of constitutional amendment to say that basically that anyone with a title no woman could have the title pastor at all.
So this is what, correct me if I'm wrong, this was known as the Law
The law
Amendment
amendment,
because the guy named after the guy who suggested it.
Yeah.
So I think one of the arguments, maybe I got this from your articles, is that, well, there are a lot of women who lead like children's ministries at a
Yeah.
lot of these churches. You call them like the children's pastor or
Yes,
whatever.
the music pastor or the associate pastor or the associate minister, those terms. So that, yeah, there
Can
are.
you just give them like, I mean, would it make a big difference if you just said, oh, you know, the children's pastor on our staff? Yeah, she's now the children's teacher.
Yes.
Would that be fine then?
That would be fine for them. Yeah, they would say, well, that's a complicated question. For some people, that would be fine. But some churches would say, well, no, they might not be the senior pastor, but they're a leader. And we want to recognize that they're a leader in a church. And so give them the title pastor means that they have some leadership role, not the senior leadership role. But there are some folks also would say, well, no, if they function in a leadership role, that then they also shouldn't be there. So this is a complicated one. So this law amendment basically said that the convention would bar churches that have a woman pastor of any kind. Well, this has led to a debate. Does that mean any person with the title pastor? Does that mean anyone with the function of pastor, any leadership function? Because there are churches in the Southern Baptist Convention where women cannot teach a mixed classroom of men and women. So the Sunday school class of men and women, the woman can't be in charge. Not all of them there. So there's all kinds of different beliefs about this.
But if the law amendment passed, then even places where women are only teaching women or women are pastors who teach Sunday school classes to children, those churches could get expelled.
Yes, they could have gotten expelled. I don't think there was a rush to it, but they would no longer have been welcome, basically.
Okay. So what's the process for getting one of these amendments into law?
So basically you have to pass it twice. You have to pass it 2 years in a row. So last year this thing passed with like a 90% margin, overwhelmingly. This year, there was kind of some folks saying, hold on, wait a second. One, because there are a lot of black churches where women have a role pastor, they're not the senior pastor. There are a lot of churches where you have music minister or chids pastor or pastor to women. So there are a lot of folks who otherwise agree with everything the Southern Baptists do, but they have women who have a title or title of minister, which we use as a synonym for a pastor. So all of a sudden folks said, well, this could be a whole bunch of people who agree with us and don't want to have a senior pastor as a woman getting kicked out. And then doesn't mean we're also going to go after churches where a woman functions in leadership, and this will cause chaos. And that became so the amendment. So you have to pass it 1 year. You have to pass 2 years in a row. So it failed. It needed 2/3 of the vote. It got 60%. So it failed.
So what happened between last year and this year when it gets 80-90% of the vote the first time around and then drops to like 61% this time around?
Well, I think it's two. That last year was in New Orleans. It's a very southern state. This was in Indiana, so it's probably a little different crowd. But also, I think people just started saying, wow, wait a sec. Do we want to have this kind of do we want to have a mass exodus? Do we want to throw out black churches? Also, do we want to be dealing with a lot of these? So this church in Alexandria, Virginia, they had a case where the church's belief about men and women in the pastorate is different than the denomination's official belief, and they kicked them out. That was part of the argument too. The argument was that they have a process already if this happens, where it's a significant or clear difference. And so they don't really need to make a constitutional amendment that would expand that. So what they had basically said, what we have is already working. We don't really need to expand this to be a much larger group of churches we're talking about.
It's amazing how much airtime and life this sucks out given the things they could be discussing.
Yeah, it took a lot of energy and time. And so it did kind of clarify. Well, it it basically functionally, this is the way I would describe it. The functionally that if you have the senior pastor, or if you think you might be able to have a senior pastor who's a woman at your church, you're not on the. This is not the place for you anymore.
So the amendment failed, even
Yes.
though a majority of
Yes.
delegates
Yes.
voted
Yes.
for
Of
it
course.
this time around, 60%. So what does that mean now? Is someone going to try to bring it up again in the future? Maybe limit the definition somehow, narrow it
Yeah.
down?
So
Or
some.
churches be like, well, okay, we won't call
Okay.
her senior pastor, but guess what? We're
Yeah.
fine with women. They can all come on board. We'll call them
Yes.
all associate
Yes.
pastors.
So you could
You
have.
can't
You
do
probably won't have
anything
that.
to us.
You could probably. I think if someone wants to make a fight over it, they could make a fight over it, right? So that could happen. Here's the thing about the Southern Baptist Convention. You have to understand this is part church service, part like family reunion, and part giant business meeting. And so there's 11,000 messengers, any one of whom can get up on a microphone and make an emotion pretty much about whatever they want to do, right? So Mike Law was not a powerful preacher, leader. He's just a guy up at a church who, and the way they do it is they have times for motions, and they basically have a scrambler. They have a bunch of microphones set up, and they have a scrambler that picks, that basically scrambles the numbers and says, okay, number one is up. And then they call, and if you happen to be standing number one, you get to have your say. So Mike Law was standing on a mic and got his say, and this set it into motion. So he set this whole, you can set the whole denomination's annual meeting into and kind of dominate the conversation by just being the right person at the microphone. It's democracy in very pure form. So
I gotta become a delegate.
You got to tell if a church will let you, if a church will send you as a messenger. Nice. So you just have to give money to the convention, and basically you get to be, and you have to say that you're in line with them, and then you can get to be a messenger.
Mr. Beast, where are you? So let's switch gears for a second.
Yes.
Let's talk about sexual abuse, because I have no idea where things stand right now.
Okay.
So as far as I know, the SBC was under federal investigation and still is. And I also want to know, like, where does that investigation stand? And last year they said, we take this seriously. We're going to put together a task force to deal with sexual abuse. And then what happened with that as well?
Okay, so there's two different things. So let's talk about the task force first. So a couple of years, 2 years ago, they passed these reforms. So they realized they had a problem with sexual abuse. And this is one of the first times where, like, the leaders of regular churches and lay people had a vote in this. So basically there were some investigations saying there was sexual abuse in the SBC, and that if the leaders of the denomination really weren't taking it seriously. And this made church members mad. So at their annual meeting, they call for an investigation to say, what have our church leaders been up to with sexual abuse? The church leaders did not want to have an investigation and tried to send their motion about having an investigation to a committee. The people on the floor they voted to overrule the chair of the meeting. They took control and said, we're going to have an investigation. We're going to find out what they were up to. When they found out what they were up to, which is basically minimizing the problem of sexual abuse and saying they could not address it in any way cooperatively, the people got pissed. Sorry, I said pissed. I shouldn't say that. They got picked off, right? They were like,
okay,
no.
They're all atheists watching this. You're fine.
I know, but I probably let's not put that clip on social media. The people in the pews got really angry and said, no, we do not want sexual abuse in our pews. We want to cooperate together to make it hard for people to be abusers. And if they abuse, that they're not going to come back. So they wanted to put together a database of people who are convicted of abuse. They wanted to have a resources, basically somewhere you can call. You find out there might be abuse in your church, you can call someone. And they wanted to put together like training stuff. But the problem was they put a task force in charge. And if you know anything, a volunteer task force has no power, right? Volunteer task force. And 2 years later, they said, well, we didn't get, aside from putting together some good training materials, they didn't have anything done. And so this year they came back, and the messengers said, okay, you didn't get anything done. We're going to put a a denominational committee, which actually has staff together to make these happen. So they
So at
haven't.
this point, that task force last year, they actually had a staff. They had something of a budget-ish.
No, nothing.
Nothing
They
last
got
year,
nothing. That's
just
the
all
problem.
volunteer.
It's all volunteer, which is the problem, right? So volunteers very busy trying to get things done. They got no money. They have no clout. And can you hear my dog barking in the background?
You know what? The funny thing is, I do a podcast weekly, and there is a dog involved in that one too. So
Okay,
yes,
so
I don't
well,
think
our
anyone would
dog is
care.
barking in the background. So anyway,
A question about the database, going back a little bit, a
yeah,
few years ago, I feel like what set this sexual abuse scandal for the Southern
yeah,
Baptists in motion was that reporters uncovered so
yes,
many of these
yes, yeah,
stories, and they put together something of a
yes,
database of people who had been charged with crimes,
yeah,
but were working at a church,
yeah,
currently working in a church.
yeah,
This database was supposed to be like the internal version of what those
yes,
reporters
it
already
was.
did. So
It
why
was.
was it so hard to put together?
Okay, so two reasons. One, a newspaper has First Amendment protections that a denomination doesn't have for publishing it. And second, a newspaper does not have the kind of money that a denomination has, and it's harder to sue a newspaper. Basically, that's the reason. It's hard to sue a newspaper if you publish a database of convicted folks. You can, if you put together a list, it's easier to sue a church, basically.
Okay, so that was the reason. That's one thing a lot of people wanted to know, because I feel like they were saying there might be abusers and maybe they do get charged and arrested, and
Yeah,
that's a good thing. That's what should happen to
yeah,
those people. But a lot of people, if they're not convicted or charged,
yeah,
or it's swept under the rug, they might just move to a church across the street,
yes, yeah,
another state. And how are we communicating all these things?
yes,
It's kind of like you got to rely on a whisper network, or you
yes,
got
yeah.
to just know that this is a bad dude. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, like a couple weeks or maybe last month, the SBC's like research arm at Lifeway did a survey, and they found that only like 50 to 60% of churches were even doing background checks.
Yes. So that's an interesting thing, because we don't know we don't know what that number means, right? Because we don't know how many were doing it before. We don't know if more people are doing now. It does seem like more churches. Well, it does seem like the people who do the background checks are churches with large numbers of people, and the most people are at big churches. So, but yeah, we don't know how many people do these background checks. So they're gonna have to do a couple years in a row to find out if they've made progress or not. But yeah, no, this is a big question.
So now that the task force is basically disbanded, I
Yeah,
think, they said we did put together resources. So if you
yeah,
work at a church, we have manuals you can use to tell
yeah.
you what you ought to do, but there is no database. And as far as I know, they're kind of done with
Well,
sexual abuse now,
so
or like what's going to happen
so
now?
all right, so they did give it to what's called the executive committee, which is like essentially the national back office of the denomination. It doesn't have any hierarchical power, but it does have some staff and money, and more importantly, its leader has some clout. So they have said, okay, we're going to charge that group with getting the database running, with kind of carrying this forward. Now that group has a new leader who is kind of a take charge person, and that group, complicating this is that the leader of that group, the leadership of that group has been in chaos. They had one guy leave because he didn't want to do sexual. Well, they had one guy leave because of an inappropriate relationship. Then his successor left because he didn't want to deal with sexual abuse. That guy's successor left because he forged his resume. So they had a series of bad leaders, right? So now they got a guy who had been running one of their seminaries, who's well respected, and then they had somebody who's going to take the job, and then looked at it and said, "This is too much of a mess. I'm not going to take it." So they haven't had someone in that role who could help that task force get anywhere. So now they said, okay, they got a new guy in charge who used to run a seminary, so he knows all the players. He is sort of he gave a speech at the convention. He's basically, I want to do my work boring and effective, right? So, and he might be able to get it further, but we'll know in a year. So
Okay.
it's not dead, but I think there is kind of a question of like, well, will it die because of just because people will run out of steam?
Um, and maybe for the, I mean, that sounds like a win for the abusers in some way, which is really disappointing to say. And
Yeah,
it's also frustrating because the SBC seems to have an unlimited supply of cash at their
yeah,
disposal. So it's not a problem of not having the funding to hire a staff or lawyers who can guide you through
yeah.
the problems, the navigation of creating this
So,
database.
and the interesting part about this is, I often tell people the Southern Baptists are $1 billion organization that pretends it doesn't exist. And what I mean by that is, if you count their entities, like they have seminaries and they have these two giant mission boards, put all their budgets together, that's $1 billion. But their administrative arm is very small. It's a couple $1 million with the stat of budget, with no oversight over these entities, they call them. Those entities are only they have boards of directors, which the annual meeting appoints, but the annual meeting then can't tell those trustees what to do. So there isn't they don't have an infrastructure. Like the Catholic Church has a hierarchy and infrastructure that figures out who the clergy will be, that oversees all the stuff. They have none of it. They don't really. It's a shoestring. It's $1 billion shoestring operation.
It's
And
kind of
so
amazing that they can't get their stuff together when it comes to sexual abuse. But if they wanted to, they could absolutely take charge and make sure there are no women
so
pastors running a church.
so what and what's that? See, that's an easier thing to do, right? Just vote somebody out. But what is interesting is that the messengers, so the local church representatives, some are clergy, some are lay people, have voted 3 years in a row now to get these of reforms done. And they aren't going to get up and stomp their feet and get angry, but they're just going to keep voting to tell someone to do it. Now they've told someone to do it who actually has some clout and money. So we'll see what happens.
So let's talk about in vitro fertilization, because that was
Yeah.
another issue that came up here. They voted. What is it that they voted on
Okay.
to adopt when it comes to IVF?
They voted on a resolution, which is a non-binding sort of statement of, here's something we think, which basically I would say, like a caution flag on in vitro, to say there are ethical issues here that you should be paying attention to, and that they'd like more government restrictions, but on in vitro. They did not call for a ban or call for people not to do it. They call for people to be more cautious with it, basically.
Which is interesting because, I mean, there's a question one person is asking here: what's with the SBC banning IVF when we know none of them use it in the first place? Well, that's the thing; they do use it.
They
A lot
do
of
use
them
it. Yeah,
use
a
it.
lot of them use it.
And the ethical issue, of course, is that if you're doing IVF, the cheaper and more viable way to do it is you save the eggs that are
Yeah,
taken to be used in the future. And if you end up not using them, these people think that amounts to an abortion /
yeah.
murder of a human being, is I think a phrase I heard.
There's some of that. So there's again, it's all complicated, right? So yes, so part of it is there is if you do IVF, you want to create more embryos, and actually they freeze them in the process called vitrification, which makes it into a glass-like freezing. So it's really quite effective. And so and what can happen is that folks who have infertility, they never know if it's going to work, right? So you're going to have more embryos. So that's one question. What happens to the embryos who are left over? They have other ethical questions. They have ethical questions about gender selection. So in IVF, you can pick the gender of the embryo and discard ones based on the gender. You can screen for disability. So those are some things they're also worried about. There's also some concerns about there are private equity funds that run fertility clinics, and there's questions about that. There's questions about what happens if things are this is what happened in Alabama. There's questions if you go to a fertility clinic and you spend a lot of money to have these embryos, right? And there's been a couple incidents. They don't have very many accidents, but when they do, they're bad, right? So in Alabama, some got taken out and thrown up, destroyed. Now those couples are not able to, and those are couples who could not do more attempts, right? They didn't even have the money, or they were not physically able to do this. There was a big one in California where like a couple tanks with thousands and thousands of embryos. So there's a question of like, okay, what are these? What's the value? Because they have some value to the
So there are
parents.
interesting ethical
Yeah, there are
dilemmas
all
that we
kinds of
could be discussing
yes,
here.
yes,
But it seems to me, if I'm reading that
yes,
IVF statement from the SBC, they were pretty much
yeah,
focused on this counts as abortion too, so we're
yes.
against
So
it.
there's that too. There's that too.
Okay,
So they
so
have
they passed this resolution, but it's non-binding,
it's not binding, but it did.
but
What
it matters. Why
it
does it
does matter.
matter?
It matters for a couple reasons. It matters because now people, because you read it on in the headlines and say, "Oh, is IVF wrong?" If you're a church member, you think, "Wait, you'll." It matters because folks doing infertility are now caught up in the whole abortion war kind of situation. It matters because they were trying to influence federal policy. So what was more interesting to me is that the SBC has a thing called the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is basically their ethics and lobbying arm. And they sent a letter to the Senate saying, we don't want you to expand access to IVF, there was a proposal in the Senate to do that, to require insurance companies to cover infertility. They did
And
not
that was
want
like a Ted Cruz thing.
that was Ted Cruz, and it just failed, right? So it does have that kind of thing. So
So
yeah,
it sounds like the Alabama Supreme Court said IVF is abortion, it's illegal.
yeah,
Alabama's like legislature, I think, overturned that basically
yes,
with a
exactly.
law. And now you have the SBC, which is obviously conservative, which has influence over
Yeah,
conservatives. And they're saying, yeah, we politically speaking, this is where we are urging you. Like, it's not
yes,
just we're encouraging you to do this. We're saying
yes,
when you are thinking about voting, they didn't say this, but they're
yes,
implying it. When you were thinking about voting, when you're thinking about where to send your money to, we want you to support politicians implicitly who are also against IVF, which
yes.
apparently means Katie Britt, Ted Cruz, like bad.
Yeah, it's a very complicated thing. So basically, now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned, I mean, it is fascinating feud in the anti-abortion movement between folks who what they call themselves the pro-life movement, who have the sort of like they've always been against Roe v. Wade. They want to put limits on abortion. And then the folks who are what are called abortion abolitionists, who want to criminalize abortion not just for providers, but for women who have abortions. So they're a little more, and IVF has now gotten caught up in this feud. And so the head of the Southern Baptist largest seminary has kind of aligned himself with this abolitionist movement that basically would say that if you had an abortion, you ought to be jailed, which is not what the other abortion foes who are known as pro-life are like. No, we don't want doctors to be able to do this, but we don't want women who have abortions to be thrown in jail. That's not what they want to do. They want to persuade people abortion is bad. They want to make it harder for doctors to do it, but they don't want to throw mass numbers of women in jail. This other group is like, if we got to throw mass numbers of women in jail, that's what we want to do. So
I mean, they
that's
committed murder according to
exactly.
them.
So and these folks who believe that it was murder. So it is all of a sudden there's a kind of feud in this thing of like, what's the future of the anti-abortion? So in some ways they're becoming, in their theology, more Catholic, because
Catholic Church opposes IVF.
Yeah, IVF, and but that Catholic Church wouldn't say throw women who have abortions into jail either. So
when they were discussing this particular resolution, I think there were people at the meeting who were speaking. They were voicing their opinions, getting their say before the vote took place.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, I think, were saying things like, I had a kid through IVF. That kid was a blessing.
Yes.
And that just didn't seem to resonate, I guess. It didn't go very far.
It did. Well, so that's a whole complicated. Yes. I feel like everything I say is complicated. One of the things actually to remember about this resolution is it came in the last session. It was supposed to be voted on the day before, on Tuesday. It was supposed to be voted on early on. And it probably would have had more, they would have had more time to debate it and more rigorous discussion. But instead, it kept getting pushing back, right? Because they kept having other things come up. So by the time they got there on Wednesday afternoon, and Tuesday, they had basically 12 hours of meeting. It started at 8 in the morning and ended at like 8:30 at night.
Guys are party animals.
They do. These guys get up in the morning. They get things done. And they'd had events on Monday night till the middle of the night, till like 9 o'clock at night. So then they had the law amendment. They had a big fight over a move to censor some of their leaders, and they had a runoff in the presidential race. So by the time they got to Wednesday afternoon, they didn't give much time. They had 5 minutes to discuss this, and two, no one was in the mood to discuss anything. They're like, yeah, okay, that sounds all right. Yes, there wasn't. That's part of the criticism of the actually has been some of the feedback on the resolution. Is like, this is a complicated issue. We ought to be talking about it have a longer term discussion about this, not 5 minutes. So it's harder to know.
This is the same answer you were talking about when it came to the women pastors thing.
Yes.
Like, there's nuance involved here,
yes.
but they have not resolved that, and that led to concerns down the line because no one knows what that law means.
Yeah. So
and now with IVF too, it's like, well, what about this? What about infertile couples? What about these issues? If they're not discussing it, then what the heck are all these people voting on?
That's the question. Is why did you have this resolution, and why now? Because they have long had resolutions like on human cloning and on genetic kind of
like testing before birth, or
genetic testing before birth, cloning, stem cells, editing the human genome, all those kind of things they've had. They've never had one that says IVF, and really the Alabama court case has prompted this for. And really, what's interesting in the Alabama court case, if you talk to IVF ethicists, they would say, well, there are some issues worth talking about here. What is the value of this thing? You know, what about all these other issues that are not being spoken about? And IVF is not regulated very much, and has and because it's so popular, there's not a lot of interest in regulating it. So that we saw in Alabama, when you couldn't do IVF, people are like, wait. No, we want to do, because I think they see, here's the other problem, other really interesting thing. If you think about abortion, the way they would see it is that abortion, you have someone who's pregnant, they want to end the pregnancy. That they see as ethically is wrong, right? In IVF, the goal is people want to have children. And they are
matches what
they want, right? They want people to have children. They think children are a blessing. Okay, well, that's what people, and they are probably, people having IVF are probably more like, though everyone has abortions, folks who have abortions tend to have less money, tend to be less, from some circumstances that do not make it, that are amenable to being a parent or having another kid. Folks who have IVF are more like the people, because
you got to have money to do IVF,
right? And religion in America is a luxury good, right? People with more education, more money tend to be more religious, and so they're gonna know folks who have IVF, and they're gonna know folks who they think, and they know kids who have IVF. So it's gonna be harder to say. It is harder for leaders to say, well, you should be against this, and this is abortion, this is murder. I don't know how that's going to go.
It's very interesting. Like, if you wanted to talk about vaccines as well, there are legitimate concerns about the pharmaceutical industry and testing and stuff, but those seem to be pushed aside because people fell for the most extreme arguments against it, maybe, including conspiratorial ones. And when it comes to the IVF thing, like you're saying, there are all these ethical issues. But by just saying, it's murder. So if you like murder, support IVF. If you don't, vote for this resolution. And then they vote for this resolution. But that may have an impact on how all of these Southern, I mean,
Yes.
the Southern Baptists is the largest Protestant
Yes. Yeah.
denomination. And if you're saying this is something that matters to, it's going to impact what
Yeah.
pastors
Yes.
preach, which means it's going to impact how these people might vote.
Yeah.
Um,
It
this
could.
is,
Yes. Yeah.
that's
No,
scary.
it's not binding, but it does. It does. It makes a big statement. They have a loud megaphone, and whether the message is clear or not, and what the message, whether whether intention was to, whatever their intention was, the message that came across is that IVF is bad, and people who do it are bad, and there are, and the message that didn't come across is what the other message they wanted to say is that there are ways to do this ethically. There are things you should think about. So that was their intention. When you talk to the resolutions committee, this is why they brought it out to get. There's a committee that does this. They say everyone sends resolutions. We're going to resolve all kinds of stuff. They weed them out and say these are the most important ones.
Okay. This is a question someone was asking, but since we're talking about this, it seems to go along these lines. With people increasingly leaving organized religion, was there any concern voiced at SBC that these hardline rules will further alienate more moderate members or potential new members?
So one with the IVF thing, there was folks who got up and said, wait, this is going to make it a lot harder for people who've had IVF who want to come to our church to want to come there. There wasn't, they have concerns about the end of organized religion. They don't see that their hardline rules will as being, they see that as becoming more faithful to truth. And so that what they want to do is get people who have left to understand the truth. And so that has not been but this has been, I think that was with the law amendment, for example, the women's pastor thing. That's part of it. They're more diverse, right? So they have worked really hard. So one thing that's really interesting about Southern Baptists and evangelicals generally is they are more ethnically diverse than more progressive denominations, right? So the Lutherans, Episcopal Church, even the Methodists are fairly white denominations. The evangelicals have become more diverse. As they become more diverse, all of a sudden, not everyone is on board with all the kind of rules that everyone had before. On LGBT, they are probably on board, but not on women ministries and those kind of things. So,
and I mean, you mentioned this earlier when it comes to like the law amendment and whether women can be pastors. Had they gone through and passed that amendment and could have expelled all these
yeah,
churches with women pastors, that would have specifically affected a lot of Black churches that are
yes, yeah,
members of the
yeah,
SBC, low income places that rely on, they don't have all the staffers they need. They
yes,
rely
yeah.
on those volunteers.
So so that would have been. I think there was a lot of like, how do we? Because if you make it a constitutional amendment, it's a kind of cut and dry. You're out. Tells people not to come. If you say this is our belief, but if you have some interpretation for the case by case, then you have to, then it makes it. It's going to be, it's less hard line, I guess.
Do you think then these issues that we've been discussing, that they were discussing, does that do more to push moderates out, or does it end up helping them because people are like, well, you guys are not wishy-washy on these issues. I like people who know what their principles are, and so we support you, and they come in. I feel like it's going to push them out, but
there's probably no moderate. So moderate's a bad word among Southern Baptists. That used to be what the liberals were. Now, a Southern Baptist liberal is not very liberal, but there are what's happened in the Southern Baptists now are the conservatives are fighting about stuff. Who can be more conservative? Everyone has got to be more conservative. So and there's less room for disagreement.
The less conservative SBC person is the person who says, I'm against IVF. I just don't call it murder.
I just don't call it murder. Yeah. So I might, or on abortion, I'm against abortion. I think abortion should be illegal. I don't want to throw women in jail. That is considered liberal, right? So there was a push to this Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. There's a law in, it might be Louisiana, one of the southern states, that basically would have outlawed abortion completely, would have had penalties for women who have abortions. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, along with almost all the other major pro-life groups, all against abortion, all want lots of restrictions, but all do. And if they want crimes, it would be for providers, not for women who have. Well, they all wrote a letter saying, please don't pass a law that would put people in jail who have abortions, because we don't think that's right. So this became a huge deal. So there was a guy who gets up who's an abolitionist. That's his position. So he gets up. We need to abolish this Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is very conservative.
I wanted to ask you about that. Yeah,
because they're not abolitionists, and so therefore we have to get rid of them. They're liberals.
And that's I think Russell Moore, who runs Christianity Today now, used to be the head of the Ethics and Liberty Commission. They accused him, I think, repeatedly of being too liberal for their organization.
The person at job always gets always is going to attract attention for saying things. So Richard Land, who was there before, a GOP kind of activist, but also would say that Muslims have a right to build mosques, which got people mad, right? Because he's like, we believe in religious liberty. So it is a fire,
literally in our name.
Yes, So it is a kind of job that gets you in trouble at times. But there has been a group of people in the last few years who just want to get rid of them.
And so that plan to abolish the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, that failed.
It failed. It has failed.
I saw from some conservatives, Christians online, they were so mad that failed. But what's the argument everyone's like, no, we can keep them around. They're fine. What's the argument for keeping them there if that's such a group and a position that attracts so much vitriol?
One, because they want to have a voice in Washington, and two, they do want to have some guidance on ethical issues and so on. Excuse me.
Do they want those guidance on ethical issues when it seems like that nuance goes to die on these on the floor when they're voting on these issues?
But they also stand up for ethic. So what? One of the things that's happened as well is things that 20 years ago that folks who are in the GOP could have been for. So we had, when under George W. Bush, real pushes for immigration reform, right? From Democrats and Republicans. That was a bipartisan issue. So this Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, because they think ethically that people who come across the border are people made in God's image, they should be treated fairly, that we should have orderly immigration, because they have been for immigration reform, all of a sudden they're seen as Democrats and they're evil. Which they're just like, well, this is what the Bible says. Well, we don't care. The Bible says you're for open borders, you must be Democratic. So things that they could have been for 20 years ago, they can't be for now.
Let me ask you about I feel like this should have been the biggest headline, and it was so not because of all these other things we're talking about. Who is the new president of the SBC, and how does he differ from his predecessor?
So Clint Presley is his name. He's a very interesting person. So he's a megachurch pastor. I mean, we kind of joked about him. He's a megachurch pastor who wears a suit, which is, you see a lot of megachurch pastors now wear jeans. He doesn't wear jeans. He's kind of a mix. He's an old school, kind of very conservative, very complementarian, but not kind of not fire and brimstone. But he has all the same conservatives and everything else. The couple things that were interesting to me about him. One is a really terrible story. They had a church member who was accused of abusing his daughter. The daughter goes to the church runs a school. The daughter goes to school. The daughter told the people at the school that this was happening and that her mom didn't know about it. And so they called the police right away, and they called child protection, and the guy was arrested. And so then when the guy was arrested, they told the whole church to say, look, this happened. He's been arrested. So we want anyone who ever came across this guy, because he'd been a longtime volunteer. They wanted people to know. So in case anything happened, they're like, if anything happened, you come and tell us.
And by the way, that sounds like the responsible way to handle it.
But this has been what they've gotten in trouble for not doing before. Mm-hmm. So he was, and what he said at their meeting was that until a few years ago, they had not been as proactive about the stuff. But when the big investigation came and they got a better sense of how the big the scopus was, when there was a lot of push to do training, they said, well, we got to do training. So they did all the training so that they were ready when this happened. And they've learned from the mistakes of other churches.
And when Clint Presley
Yeah,
was running for president of
yeah,
the SBC, which he won that
yeah.
election. Uh, he was one of the more conservative
Yes, he's one of the more
people
conservative.
on the ballot, so to
Yes,
speak. He was supportive, I think, of the law
he's part
amendment.
of the law amendment. Yeah,
Is there a, I mean, how does that compare to Bart Barber, who was the previous president? Like, is he, Bart Barber, obviously also conservative on
conservative.
all
Yes,
these views?
yeah.
Where do they differ?
They're probably very, very similar. Buckshot Barber is more folksy, more of a kind of. Barber was a smaller church, a very and we all love Bob Barber as a reporters because he before he became president, he was our expert on all things Southern Baptist, like polity. If you want to know the intricacies of parliament procedure, you'd call him. So then he was like, and he was like the normal size church member. Also, not because he was a regular size job. So there was a
Like, he was just running a regular church,
regular
not a
size
crazy
church, right?
mega
Not
church.
kind of a church. And so if he did something that went badly, right? People got mad about it. He'd say, "Okay, I hear you. If I did the wrong thing, I'm sorry." Like he has that kind of
You won't see like Joel Osteen or some
yeah, yeah.
mega church like
So,
apologizing about anything.
so Presley was yeah, Presley's from a bigger church, kind of a little more maybe less folksy, accessible, but same sort of not of the kind of extreme, more angry, kind of stereotypes of folks, not probably throw people in jail for abortion, though he thinks abortion is wrong.
Right.
He had a son who died of an overdose, which is so he's got a more
I want to say he has more empathy, but I
I'm
don't
open
know.
he might have more. I think this is a person. He's not. He just comes across a kind of a no nonsense regular guy, but also he's had a more complex life, right? So been exposed to, and if you're a minister any size, you've dealt with a lot of human, but you're maybe it's not you who's dealt with the human um, failings in the way that he has dealt with. So I'm really interested to see how that shapes him.
I'm curious, like with Bart Barber, like he was on 60 Minutes
Yeah.
as kind of the new face of the
Yes.
SBC dealing with the sexual abuse scandal. I thought, I mean, I didn't like his answers, but I thought he
Yes.
came across as a nice enough guy until you
Yes.
listen to what he said. Um, if this guy, Clint Presley, does he give off that same vibe? Is he
He
like
does
the sort of
some.
person that you
I,
put him on TV, he comes across as likable despite
I
his
think
views?
so. I think so. A little more, maybe a little more reserved. I don't think he'd be as excited to do 60 Minutes. Not that Bart was excited to do this, but Bart would
I'm
be like,
sure.
okay, just Clint's
I mean,
like,
if 60 Minutes is calling, it's not because you're gonna
yeah,
be
yeah,
looking
no,
great
yeah. But you
in
know what I mean?
theory.
I think it'd be maybe a little less press excited. Some people get in the job and they like the press. I don't know if that he is a person who wants the press.
So it's, I mean, given his conservative resume on all this stuff, I get why he would be the next president of the SBC. Who were these other candidates who lost to him? Like, were they
So,
more conservative? Were they not conservative enough? Or what was it
there,
that
there,
people didn't like about them?
that's interesting. So there were two. The one guy, there's another mega church pastor who had been in charge of the abuse reforms. There was a very large church pastor in Tennessee. There was a very conservative seminary professor. Uh, Another pastor from Oklahoma who's Native American, also been involved with abuse reform. And then another guy from where? From East Tennessee, big church. So the folks who were not for the law amendment, they didn't do as well. So if you weren't for the law amendment, you didn't do as well. And
They
then
were too liberal. They were out.
yeah, I don't know if they're too liberal, but they didn't get enough votes. But it was all none of these folks were like head and shoulders above the rest. So everyone's votes were pretty close. One guy's from a very tiny church, very, very conservative. He didn't get as many votes. But the guy from Oklahoma didn't get as much votes. Of the four, but the other four candidates were very close to each other. In fact, so that they take the top three candidates for a runoff. There were six of them. The difference between the third and fourth guy were like 25
Oh,
votes.
wow.
So those four were all seen as sort of the same. There was there was no giant differences between them.
Okay. And then with the three who were in that runoff or a second runoff or whatever, That, I mean, again, it doesn't sound like there's a light and day
Yeah,
difference here between any of those dudes.
yeah,
So
and one of them was a seminary professor who was more conservative, not really excited about abuse reform. He dropped out. Um, the two left, but the other thing the two left for, they were very they were known for their sort of involvement in the things Southern Baptists care mostly about, which is about missions and their cooperative program, which funds both missions and seminaries and disaster relief and all these other kinds of stuff. And they're more institutional folks. They're like, hey, well, we also gotta raise money for missionaries and do this other stuff. So they were folks whose churches gave a lot of money to that, which probably gave them a little more clout.
I got one last question for
Yeah,
you then, which is just now that the gathering is over,
yeah.
where do you see the next year of the SBC going relative when it comes to membership, when it comes to how they are in the news for any reason? What are the big stories that you think you'll see in the next year for them?
Well, so one story that's gonna probably get some more press is, and we asked about earlier, is the federal investigation. So there's a Department of Justice investigation into their handling of sexual abuse. We think the DOJ doesn't tell you anything, and they've been really tight-lipped on this. There's been one person who was indicted over basically not cooperating with, basically lying to federal officials over this. So you might have another indictment for this. I don't know if you're going to have massive indictments or anything, because it's not really they don't have the kind of so child abuse is a state crime. It's not really a federal crime. This
Like they indicted one
one
dude
guy, yes,
recently, but that wasn't because he was a predator. It's because
no,
of he was lying to
he was lying to the
officers
Fed.
about
So you might
people.
get another case of that where they were not, where basically they were told, if you do anything with sexual abuse, tell us, and then they didn't tell them, and then they sort of tried to destroy some documents about it. It was not very,
That'll do it.
yeah, it didn't do it. So we don't know what's going to happen. There might be some big news out of that. We don't know, but it's like any federal investigation. You just don't know.
Do you think the IVF situation is going to become like the center point of the culture war battles, or is it going to
It's
be
going to
something
be
else?
that's going to be an ongoing one because
Okay.
it's gonna keep going. I think so. A couple things what I think about the SBC. One is there was kind of a MAGA versus non-MAGA civil war going on. The MAGA group got has pretty much lost, right? The kind of MAGA anti wokeness, all the kind of rhetoric. That group is not. They keep running for president. They keep getting beaten badly. They're all going to be
They all
Republicans.
keep getting beaten, but it's not like they're losing to some progressive
No.
force.
This is not this,
They're
but
losing to like someone who's totally conservative on just about
yes,
everything,
everything.
just
But there,
not
yeah,
extreme.
it's not extreme. So there's not a
More extreme.
like so. So
Okay.
Trump came there. He said that sent a video to a kind of a side thing. There weren't very many people there. Nobody really excited about it. Pence drew more people to his thing, but again,
No
they're
one's ever said that before about anything.
no, and then they're going to have, you know, I don't think they want. In fact, the funny thing. There was a motion to ban all politicians from being there during campaign season. It didn't pass on a technicality. The other reason it didn't pass is that the guy who was their recording registration secretary, he announces the votes, how many people are there. It's this kind of very folksy guy who happens to be the mayor of a tiny town in Missouri, and everyone loves him. Most politicians there, they're like, we couldn't have him be here, So but they have not had. You haven't had politicians even like 10 years ago. You had politicians kind of show up and give
You
addresses,
mean
or
at the
I
SBC
think
annual
SBC,
gathering?
yeah, and Pence came a few years ago, so that when he was running for office, that has not been. There's not been a real excitement about that anymore. To say like we don't really want to have that.
Is that coming from the SBC or is that coming from the politicians who maybe think I already got this group in the
I
bag?
think it's from the SBC folks who are like, no, we just don't want to have this here because it's already so. They're already all GOP, but also they don't want to have the MAGA kind of stuff. So the MAGA group sort of lost there. They don't get thrown out, but they're not in charge.
Do you think that is going to change anytime soon?
I think it's going to stay the same. I think it'll still stay Republican, but not MAGA Republican, and not as. I think they have some of the internal chaos might come. They've had a lot of internal chaos that made. They have a new person in charge of their executive committee. Seems like they know what they're doing. They might start. They if they can get this abuse reform over the kind of get it finally working, that'd be a big thing. The law amendment, it's going to be hard to start because you got to start all over again. So they might have a quiet year. You never know.
You never
It's
know.
Southern
Yeah.
Baptist because you never know.
Can't
But
imagine
you
they'll be
can't
quiet.
imagine. But
Um,
they might be less noisy.
one last question from
Okay.
a viewer who you had mentioned earlier that people who are more affluent tend to be more religious,
Yeah.
college educated, and stuff. This person asks, why do you think religious people tend to be more affluent in the U.S.? In many countries, it's the exact opposite, where the lower classes are the most fervently religious.
That is a super interesting question. I don't know. It's the same way, probably the same reason that marriage is a kind of a luxury good. It could be so. Some of it is the anti-institutionalism. So one thing that gets lost when we talk about the religious nuns, not atheists, but the sort of like unaffiliated, they're unaffiliated from everything, from education, from marriage and family, from religion. So that's one of the interesting things. Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing. I think that you have to have some ways you have to have a certain set of achievement because it's so tied in with marriage and family, and religion is so tied in the US to marriage and family. That could be part of it. But it is and then folks may just feel like you're no longer welcome in these things. And then we just have this disaffiliation from institutions. And it's been the less money you have, the more disaffiliated from more things. Education, marriage and family, and religion.
It is definitely a complicated question.
Yes.
With that, thank you again, Bob, for your time. I appreciate all of this. I appreciate your articles too. Where can people find your articles?
You can find us at religionnews.com where we cover every religious group and we cover atheists too. So we cover everybody.
All right. Thank you for all of you for asking questions and watching. Thank you, Guitar Dog, for your support as well.
Guitar
And
Dog, thank
Guitar
you.
Dog, yes. And all right. Thanks, Bob. We'll catch you next time.
It's
Thanks,
time.
everybody.
Yeah, bye.